I am Elise Monroe, and today I learned that 7 years of expertise can be reduced to a single word: receptionist. The coffee in my hand turned bitter the moment Brian Kessler's voice echoed through the conference room. Effective immediately. We're implementing strategic departmental restructuring to optimize human capital deployment. Corporate speak for, we're screwing you over with a smile. I'd been senior systems engineer at Vertex Dynamics for 7 years, architect of the Nexus Sync framework that powered data infrastructure for half the retail giants on the East Coast. My code had generated millions in revenue. My algorithms had prevented catastrophic system failures. And my late nights had built the backbone of everything this company claimed as their technological advantage. Now I was being demoted to answering phones. Elise, we're repositioning you to leverage your interpersonal strengths in our client-facing operations. Brian continued, his practiced smile never wavering. Around the table, my colleagues studied their laptops with sudden fascination. Nobody met my eyes. They'd all known this was coming. The nameplate on the reception desk was already printed. Elise Monroe, Client Services Coordinator. Someone had prepared for this moment with military precision. The email announcing my lateral transition had been drafted, scheduled, and sent before I'd even walked into that conference room. I set my coffee down and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, that would come later. This was calculation. Pure, crystalline calculation. Of course, I said, my voice steady as granite. When do I start? The reception desk sat in the building's main lobby like a monument to corporate humiliation. Glass walls offered no privacy. Fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, and the constant stream of visitors, delivery personnel, and gossiping employees created a fishbowl atmosphere that made every moment feel exposed. My new workstation consisted of a beige desktop computer from 2019, a phone system that belonged in a museum, and a motivational poster featuring a kitten hanging from a branch with the caption, "Hang in there." The irony wasn't lost on me. From my new vantage point, I could see directly into the conference room where Brian was presenting his revolutionary new framework to potential clients. The BK methodology. He called it Brian Kessler's personal brand stamped onto 7 years of my intellectual property. He'd renamed my algorithms, restructured my documentation, and was now taking credit for innovations that had kept me awake countless nights. Excuse me, is this where I register for the vendor meeting? A woman in an expensive suit approached my desk, her tone suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. Yes, I can help you with that. I smiled and pulled up the registration system, my fingers automatically navigating through screens I'd helped design. The bitter irony of using my own code to perform menial tasks wasn't lost on me. As the morning progressed, I began to notice patterns. The phone calls weren't random. They revealed the company's operational heartbeat. Frustrated clients complaining about system glitches. Vendors discussing delivery schedules for server hardware. IT staff coordinating maintenance windows that would impact our biggest accounts. From the reception desk, I was inadvertently positioned at the information hub of the entire organization. Every conversation, every hushed argument, every panicked whisper about technical difficulties filtered through my workspace. I was invisible to most people, just another piece of office furniture. But my ears were recording everything. The Northwind implementation is failing, I heard Marcus Thompson, our lead database administrator, telling someone on his cell phone as he walked past my desk. The query optimization is completely broken. We're looking at potential data corruption across 3 major clients. Northwind. That was the flagship project Brian had assigned to his new team after absorbing my framework. The same project he'd proudly announced would demonstrate the superiority of his innovative management approach. The same project that was apparently collapsing under the weight of his incompetence. I maintained my pleasant receptionist smile while my mind processed this information. The Northwind implementation relied heavily on data synchronization protocols I'd spent 2 years perfecting. Without understanding the underlying architecture, Brian's team was essentially flying blind, making modifications to systems they didn't comprehend. By lunch, I'd collected enough fragments of overheard conversations to piece together a troubling picture. The BK methodology wasn't just failing, it was creating cascading failures throughout our client infrastructure. Brian had stripped away the error-checking mechanisms I'd built into Nexus Sync, dismissing them as unnecessary complexity. Now those safeguards were proving essential as data corruption spread through interconnected systems. I ate my sandwich at the reception desk, watching through the glass walls as Brian held another emergency meeting with his expanded team. Stress lines etched his face as he gestured frantically at whiteboards covered in diagrams he clearly didn't understand. His audience, junior developers who'd been promoted beyond their expertise, nodded along with expressions of barely concealed panic. The afternoon brought more revealing phone calls. Legal representatives from 2 major clients demanding explanations for system failures. Urgent requests for technical documentation that Brian's team couldn't provide because they'd never understood the original architecture. Whispered conversations about potential lawsuits and contract violations. I answered each call with professional courtesy, transferring technical queries to departments that were increasingly unable to provide answers. The beautiful irony was that I possessed the knowledge they desperately needed, but I was now just the receptionist, invisible, irrelevant, and completely underestimated. As the workday ended, I gathered my purse and walked toward the elevator with deliberate calm. My transformation from respected engineer to corporate furniture had been completed in a single day. But something else had been completed too. My understanding of just how precarious Brian's position actually was. The elevator doors closed, and I allowed myself a small smile. Phase 1 of my unintentional reconnaissance mission was complete. Now it was time to begin Phase 2, turning my newfound invisibility into a strategic advantage. That evening, I sat in my apartment with my personal laptop, surrounded by legal documents and patent application forms downloaded from the USPTO website. The same methodical approach I'd used to design fault-tolerant systems would now be applied to a different kind of architecture, one designed to protect intellectual property and deliver consequences to those who'd stolen it. I'd spent years building solutions for other people's problems. Now it was time to solve my own. The next morning arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the skull. My alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of my studio apartment, dragging me from dreams of binary code and revenge fantasies into the harsh fluorescent reality of my new corporate purgatory. I dressed in the same professional attire I'd worn as a senior systems engineer, because dignity wasn't something Brian Kessler could strip away with a job title. The reflection in my bathroom mirror showed a woman who'd been pushed too far, but hadn't yet begun to push back. That was about to change. The commute to Vertex Dynamics felt different now. Instead of mentally preparing for technical challenges and architectural decisions, I was planning reconnaissance. Every overheard conversation, every glimpse of internal documentation, every fragment of gossip would be cataloged and analyzed for strategic value. The reception desk welcomed me with its familiar beige mediocrity. I settled into my chair and began the day's performance, pretending to be a beaten-down former engineer, grateful for whatever scraps of employment her former company had thrown her way. "Good morning, Vertex Dynamics. How may I direct your call?" The words tasted like ashes, but my voice remained professionally pleasant. Each call was a data point, each conversation a window into the growing chaos that Brian's incompetence was creating throughout the organization. By mid-morning, the pattern was becoming clear. The Northwind project wasn't just troubled, it was hemorrhaging money and client confidence at an alarming rate. 3 separate calls from frustrated customers demanding explanations for system failures. 2 calls from legal representatives asking about contract compliance. 1 particularly heated conversation between Brian and the CEO that I could hear through the conference room's supposedly soundproof walls. "The data integrity issues are unprecedented," Brian was saying, his voice strained with barely controlled panic. "My team is working around the clock to identify the root cause." Root cause? I almost laughed out loud. The root cause was sitting 20 feet away, answering phones and being systematically ignored by everyone who passed my desk. The root cause was Brian's decision to gut my error-checking protocols because they added unnecessary complexity to his elegant new framework. During my lunch break, I made a trip to the Delaware Secretary of State's office online portal. For $89 and 30 minutes of paperwork, Shadeline Systems LLC came into existence, a limited liability company with a registered agent in Wilmington, a business address that was really just a mail forwarding service, and a purposefully vague mission statement about consulting services in data management and systems optimization. The beauty of Delaware corporate law was its anonymity protections. Shadeline Systems was now a legal entity that could own intellectual property, enter into contracts, and conduct business without revealing the identity of its actual owner. To anyone investigating the company, it would appear to be just another technology consulting firm lost in the maze of corporate registrations that Delaware processed daily. Back at my desk, I began sketching diagrams on the back of a pizza order form someone had left by the phone. Not the organizational charts and system architectures I'd once drawn on expensive whiteboards, but something far more valuable, the blueprint for a new kind of framework that would make Brian's stolen methodology obsolete. While Brian's team struggled with the complexities of my original Nexus Sync architecture, I was designing something completely different. A distributed data processing system that would solve the same problems, but with an entirely new approach. Something that couldn't be reverse engineered or duplicated by studying existing implementations. I called it Realign Protocol. The afternoon brought more intelligence gathering opportunities. A heated phone conversation between Brian and Marcus Thompson revealed that the data corruption in Northwind was worse than anyone had initially realized. 3 major clients were experiencing cascading failures that threatened to bring down their entire inventory management systems. The financial implications were staggering, potential losses in the millions of dollars if the problems couldn't be resolved quickly. "We need someone who understands the original architecture," Marcus was saying as he paced past my desk. "Someone who can trace the data flow through the entire system and identify where the synchronization is breaking down." That someone was sitting 15 feet away, invisible in her reception desk purgatory, secretly designing the solution that would make their problem irrelevant. The irony was so perfect, it was almost artistic. As the workday ended, I found myself staying late. Not because I had reception duties that required overtime, but because the empty office gave me access to resources I couldn't use during regular hours. The building's Wi-Fi network, for instance, which my personal laptop could connect to without leaving digital fingerprints tied to my employee account. I spent the evening researching patent law with the same intensity I'd once applied to debugging critical system failures. The USPTO's patent application process was complex, but not insurmountable. More importantly, I learned about provisional patent applications, temporary protections that could be filed quickly and cheaply to establish priority dates for intellectual property claims. For $1,600 and a detailed technical description, I could file a provisional patent application that would protect the Realign protocol for 12 months while I developed the full implementation. If anyone tried to duplicate or reverse engineer my new framework during that time, they'd be infringing on protected intellectual property. The legal research led me down another fascinating rabbit hole, the doctrine of inevitable disclosure. In many jurisdictions, courts had ruled that employees with access to trade secrets couldn't simply forget that information when they moved to new positions. If I could demonstrate that Brian's team was inevitably using knowledge derived from my original work, I might have grounds for legal action even without formal patent protection. But lawsuits were messy, expensive, and unpredictable. Patents were clean, precise, and enforceable. And revenge served through legal channels was far more satisfying than anything I could achieve through corporate politics or sabotage. I shut down my laptop and gathered my things, walking through the empty office corridors that had once felt like home. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been pushed out of my domain. But that exile had given me something far more valuable than a corner office and a senior title. It had given me invisibility, motivation, and the perfect vantage point to watch my former colleagues destroy themselves with their own incompetence. Tomorrow would bring new intelligence gathering opportunities, new insights into the growing crisis that Brian's theft had created, and new progress on the solution that would make their problems irrelevant. I was no longer just a displaced engineer sitting at a reception desk. I was a strategist in the perfect position to execute the most elegant revenge in corporate history. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I allowed myself another small smile. Phase 2 was well underway. Soon. It would be time for Phase 3, turning my invisible surveillance into decisive action. The third day of my reception desk exile brought an unexpected gift: chaos. I arrived at the office to find Brian's team in full crisis mode. Their usual confident swagger replaced by the frantic energy of people whose professional lives were circling the drain. "Elise, we need to redirect all calls from Mallory Holdings to my direct line," Brian announced as he rushed past my desk. His tie askew and his usually perfect hair showing signs of stress-induced dishevelment. Under no circumstances should any media inquiries be transferred to anyone except legal. Media inquiries. That was new. I smiled pleasantly and updated the call routing system while my mind processed this development. Mallory Holdings was our largest client, a retail conglomerate that relied on Vertex Dynamics data infrastructure to manage inventory across hundreds of stores. If they were involving the media, the situation had escalated beyond simple technical difficulties. The morning's phone calls painted a picture of corporate catastrophe. Mallory Holdings' CTO, Nathan Griggs, had apparently discovered that the data corruption in their inventory management system was causing significant financial losses. Products were being overstocked in some locations while others faced critical shortages. Customer orders were being lost, vendor payments were being duplicated, and the company's quarterly earnings were in jeopardy. "This is Nathan Griggs at Mallory Holdings," came the voice through my headset as I transferred yet another emergency call. "I need to speak with someone who actually understands how your data synchronization protocols work. Not another junior developer who's going to read me troubleshooting steps from a manual." I paused, my finger hovering over the transfer button. Nathan Griggs was known throughout the industry as a no-nonsense executive who'd built his reputation on identifying and eliminating inefficiencies. He was also someone who valued results over corporate politics, which made him the perfect candidate for what I was about to do. "Mr. Griggs, I'm going to transfer you to our senior technical team," I said, following protocol while making a mental note to research his background more thoroughly. "But before I do, may I ask if you're familiar with the underlying architecture of the systems you're having trouble with?" There was a pause. "Young lady, I've been managing enterprise data systems since before most of these developers were born. The problem isn't my understanding. It's that your company seems to have deployed a framework that nobody actually comprehends." Perfect. I transferred the call to Brian's direct line and began researching Nathan Griggs with the same methodical approach I'd once used to debug complex software issues. LinkedIn, corporate filings, industry publications, within an hour. I had a comprehensive profile of a man who'd made his career by cutting through corporate nonsense to identify real solutions. More importantly, I'd identified the perfect test case for Realign protocol. During my lunch break, I made 2 important phone calls from my personal cell phone. The first was to a patent attorney I'd found through careful research, someone who specialized in software patents and had experience with provisional applications. The second was to a virtual assistant service that could provide professional phone answering for Shadeline Systems LLC. By the end of the day, I had a clear path forward. The provisional patent application for Realign protocol would be filed within 48 hours, establishing my priority claim to the intellectual property. Shadeline Systems would have professional phone support that could handle client inquiries without revealing my involvement. And I'd identified the perfect target for my first demonstration of the new framework's capabilities. That evening, I worked on the technical documentation for Realign protocol with the same intensity I'd once brought to the most challenging engineering problems. The framework needed to be more than just a solution to the data synchronization problems that were plaguing Brian's implementation. It needed to be demonstrably superior to anything Vertex Dynamics could offer. The core innovation was distributed validation architecture, instead of relying on centralized error-checking mechanisms that could be stripped away by incompetent managers. Realign protocol embedded validation logic throughout the entire data flow. Each transaction carried its own integrity checks. Each synchronization event included redundant verification steps, and the entire system was designed to fail gracefully when components were modified or removed. It was elegant, robust, and completely different from the approach I'd taken with Nexus Sync. More importantly, it was mine, protected by intellectual property laws and owned by a company that existed solely to monetize my innovations. The next morning brought the news I'd been expecting. Mallory Holdings had issued an ultimatum. Either Vertex Dynamics would resolve the data corruption issues within 72 hours, or they would terminate their contract and pursue legal action for damages. The potential financial impact was staggering, not just the loss of a major client, but potential liability for the millions of dollars in losses that the system failures had caused. Brian's response was predictable. Panic followed by desperate attempts to shift blame. I watched through the glass conference room walls as he held emergency meetings with his team, his voice rising to levels that penetrated the supposedly soundproof barriers. The original architecture was poorly documented, he was saying, gesturing frantically at whiteboards covered in diagrams that made no sense. We're having to reverse engineer fundamental components that should have been properly specified from the beginning. The beautiful irony was that my documentation had been comprehensive. Thousands of pages of technical specifications, architectural diagrams, and implementation guides. But Brian had dismissed most of it as unnecessary complexity when he'd stolen my framework and renamed it after himself. Now he was discovering that complexity had been essential, and the knowledge he'd tried to steal was impossible to replicate without understanding the underlying principles. I answered phones with professional courtesy while mentally composing the email I would send to Nathan Griggs that evening. Not as Elise Monroe, the demoted receptionist, but as a representative of Shadeline Systems, LLC, offering a consultation on enterprise data management solutions. The afternoon brought more evidence of the growing crisis. 3 more clients had reported similar data corruption issues. The company's stock price was beginning to slide as news of the technical problems spread through industry publications. And Brian's team was working around the clock in a desperate attempt to identify solutions they didn't have the expertise to implement. Elise, I need you to clear my calendar for the rest of the week, Brian announced as he hurried past my desk, his arms full of technical manuals and printouts. Cancel all non-essential meetings and tell anyone who asks that I'm working on resolving our current technical challenges. Of course, Mr. Kessler, I replied, my voice perfectly professional while my mind registered the desperation in his tone. Should I also reschedule your presentation to the board of directors on Friday? His face went pale. No, that stays as scheduled. I'll have solutions to present by then. I made the appropriate entries in his calendar system while calculating the probability of him actually having solutions by Friday. Based on my understanding of the technical problems and his team's capabilities, the chances were approximately 0. That evening, I sent the email that would change everything. It was carefully crafted to appear as a routine business inquiry from a consulting firm that had heard about Mallory Holdings' data management challenges through industry channels. The message offered a brief consultation to discuss potential solutions with no mention of my connection to Vertex Dynamics or the problems they were experiencing. The response came within 6 hours. Nathan Griggs was interested in hearing about alternative approaches to enterprise data synchronization, particularly solutions that could be implemented quickly to resolve urgent business requirements. I scheduled a video conference for the following afternoon, using Shadeline Systems' professional answering service to handle the initial coordination. The stage was set for the most important presentation of my career, one that would demonstrate the superiority of my new framework while simultaneously destroying Brian's ability to continue profiting from my stolen work. Phase 3 was about to begin. The video conference with Nathan Griggs took place in my apartment, with my laptop positioned to show only a neutral background and my most professional attire. I'd spent the morning preparing for this conversation with the same methodical approach I'd once used for high-stakes client presentations, except now I was representing my own company and my own innovations. Ms. Torres, Nathan began, using the pseudonym I'd provided for Shadeline Systems. I appreciate you taking the time to discuss our situation. I'll be direct. We're facing critical data integrity issues that our current vendor seems incapable of resolving. The financial impact is significant, and our patience is exhausted. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact through the camera. Mr. Griggs, I understand you're dealing with cascading failures in your inventory management system. Based on the symptoms you've described, I believe the problem stems from insufficient distributed validation in your data synchronization protocols. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've diagnosed our specific issue without seeing our architecture? The symptoms are characteristic of a common design flaw, I explained, clicking through a prepared presentation that outlined the realigned protocol's approach to distributed validation. Many enterprise systems rely on centralized error-checking mechanisms that become points of failure when the underlying architecture is modified or simplified. For the next hour, I walked Nathan through a technical demonstration that showcased everything Brian's team couldn't deliver. Real-time data synchronization with embedded integrity checks, graceful failure recovery that prevented cascading corruption, scalable architecture that could handle the volume and complexity of Mallory Holdings' operations. This is impressive, Nathan said as I concluded the presentation. How quickly could you implement a solution for our environment? I pretended to check my calendar. Shadeline systems could begin deployment within 2 weeks, with full implementation completed in 6 weeks. We'd also provide comprehensive documentation and training to ensure your team can maintain the system independently. And the licensing terms? This was the crucial moment. We offer exclusive licensing arrangements for enterprise clients. The initial implementation fee is $500,000, with ongoing licensing at $50,000 per month. Given the urgency of your situation, we could also discuss expedited deployment options. Nathan nodded slowly. I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting with my technical team present. If your solution can deliver what you've demonstrated, we'll move forward immediately. The call ended with a handshake agreement to proceed with detailed technical discussions. I closed my laptop and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. In 1 hour, I'd accomplished what Brian's team couldn't achieve in weeks of desperate effort. I'd provided a legitimate solution to Mallory Holdings' critical business problem. More importantly, I'd established Shadeline systems as a credible alternative to Vertex Dynamics' failing technology. The exclusive licensing agreement would prevent any other company from offering realigned protocol to competing clients, giving me tremendous leverage in future negotiations. The next morning, I arrived at the reception desk to find the office in complete chaos. News of Mallory Holdings' ultimatum had spread throughout the company, and the pressure was affecting everyone from junior developers to senior management. Brian looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the haunted expression of a man whose professional reputation was disintegrating in real time. Elise, hold all my calls except for Mallory Holdings, he instructed as he rushed past my desk. And if anyone from the media calls, transfer them immediately to legal. I updated the call routing system while observing the frantic activity in the conference rooms. Brian's expanded team was working around the clock, their whiteboards covered with increasingly desperate diagrams and flowcharts. They were trying to reverse engineer solutions to problems they didn't understand, using knowledge they'd stolen but never truly comprehended. The morning brought a series of revealing phone calls. 3 more clients had reported similar data corruption issues. The company's legal department was scheduling emergency meetings with potential litigation attorneys, and the board of directors had called an emergency session to discuss the growing crisis. During my lunch break, I received a call from Shadeline Systems' answering service. Nathan Griggs wanted to schedule the technical review meeting for the following day, with his entire IT leadership team present. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Mallory Holdings was ready to make a decision, and they needed solutions immediately. I spent the afternoon finalizing the technical documentation for Realigned Protocol while listening to increasingly desperate conversations from Brian's team. They were discovering that the data corruption problems were more widespread than initially realized, affecting not just Mallory Holdings, but potentially every client using their modified framework. The root cause analysis is incomplete. Marcus Thompson was saying during a heated phone conversation. We're treating symptoms instead of addressing the fundamental architectural flaws. Fundamental architectural flaws. I smiled as I answered another routine call. The fundamental flaw was Brian's decision to steal intellectual property he didn't understand and modify it in ways that destroyed its essential safeguards. The solution was sitting 20 feet away, but it was no longer available to Vertex Dynamics. That evening, I worked on the final preparations for the technical review meeting. The presentation needed to be comprehensive enough to demonstrate realigned protocol's superiority while remaining accessible to executives who might not have deep technical backgrounds. I also needed to ensure that the licensing terms were structured to provide maximum leverage in future negotiations. The provisional patent application had been filed that morning, establishing my priority claim to the intellectual property. Shadeline Systems LLC was now the legal owner of technology that could solve Mallory Holdings' problems, while simultaneously making Vertex Dynamics' approach obsolete. As I reviewed the presentation materials, I realized I was about to accomplish something unprecedented in corporate revenge. I wasn't just getting back at Brian for stealing my work. I was demonstrating that the work he'd stolen was inferior to what I could create when given proper motivation and legal protection. The reception desk had been intended as a humiliation, a way to marginalize me while Brian profited from my innovations. Instead, it had become the perfect vantage point from which to observe the destruction of his professional credibility and the collapse of his stolen empire. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether that destruction would be swift and decisive, or prolonged and agonizing. Either way, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The technical review meeting with Mallory Holdings took place in a conference room I'd reserved at a downtown business center, giving Shadeline Systems a professional appearance without revealing my apartment-based operations. I arrived early to test the presentation equipment and review my notes one final time. Nathan Griggs arrived with 3 members of his technical team: Sarah Chen, the Director of Data Architecture, Marcus Hendricks, the Senior Systems Administrator, and Jennifer Walsh, the Chief Information Security Officer. All seasoned professionals who'd built their careers on identifying and implementing enterprise-grade solutions. Ms. Torres, thank you for arranging this meeting on short notice. Nathan began as we settled around the conference table. As I mentioned, we're facing critical business impacts from our current data management problems. We need solutions that can be implemented quickly and maintained reliably. I launched into the technical presentation with the confidence of someone who'd spent months perfecting every detail. The realigned protocol wasn't just a theoretical framework, it was a complete solution that addressed every limitation I'd observed in Brian's botched implementation of my original work. The key innovation is distributed validation architecture, I explained, clicking through diagrams that showed data flow patterns and error recovery mechanisms. Instead of relying on centralized checking systems that can be disabled or bypassed, Realign embeds validation logic throughout the entire data pipeline. Sarah Chen leaned forward, studying the architectural diagrams with obvious interest. How does this approach handle high-volume transaction processing? We're dealing with millions of inventory updates daily across hundreds of store locations. Excellent question, I replied, advancing to a slide that showed performance benchmarks. Realign protocol uses parallel processing streams with intelligent load balancing. Each transaction carries its own validation context, which eliminates bottlenecks that occur when multiple processes compete for centralized resources. For the next 2 hours, I fielded technical questions that demonstrated both the depth of Mallory Holdings' problems and the sophistication of their technical team. These were people who understood the difference between superficial solutions and fundamental innovations. They recognized that Realign protocol wasn't just an alternative to their current system. It was a generational advancement that would provide competitive advantages for years to come. Implementation timeline? Jennifer Walsh asked, her tone suggesting she was already convinced of the technical merits. 6 weeks from contract execution to full deployment, I replied. Shadeline Systems provides comprehensive project management, including data migration, staff training, and ongoing support. We also guarantee system performance benchmarks with financial penalties if we don't meet agreed-upon specifications. Nathan nodded approvingly. And the exclusive licensing arrangement? The terms I outlined previously remain valid, I confirmed. Exclusive licensing ensures that your competitive advantages aren't available to other retailers. The technology becomes part of your strategic infrastructure rather than a commodity service. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to finalize contract terms within 48 hours. As the Mallory Holdings team filed out, Nathan lingered behind for a private conversation. Ms. Torres, I have to ask, how did Shadeline Systems develop such an advanced solution so quickly? This level of sophistication typically requires years of research and development. I met his gaze directly. Mr. Griggs, sometimes the best innovations come from people who've seen exactly what doesn't work and are motivated to build something better. Shadeline Systems was founded specifically to address the limitations we've observed in current enterprise data management approaches. He smiled knowingly. Well, whatever your background, you've created something remarkable. Mallory Holdings is eager to move forward. I returned to my apartment that evening with a signed letter of intent and a commitment to finalize the licensing agreement within 24 hours. The initial payment of $500,000 would be wired to Shadeline Systems' business account as soon as the contracts were executed, followed by monthly licensing fees that would provide ongoing revenue for years to come. More importantly, I'd established Realign Protocol as the definitive solution to the problems that Brian's team couldn't solve. Mallory Holdings would become a showcase client, demonstrating the superiority of my technology while highlighting the inadequacies of Vertex Dynamics' approach. The next morning, I arrived at the reception desk to find the office in complete meltdown. Brian was standing in the center of the main conference room, surrounded by whiteboards covered in desperate calculations and half-formed diagrams. His team looked like they'd been working all night, their faces drawn with exhaustion and frustration. We need to completely rebuild the validation layer, he was saying, his voice cracking with strain. The current architecture is fundamentally flawed. Fundamentally flawed. I smiled as I settled into my reception chair and powered up the ancient computer system. Brian was finally beginning to understand the scope of the problems he'd created when he'd stolen my work and modified it beyond recognition. The morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Nathan Griggs wanted to speak with someone from Vertex Dynamics senior management about Mallory Holdings' decision to terminate their contract and pursue alternative solutions. The conversation was transferred to Brian's direct line, and I could hear his side of the discussion through the conference room's inadequate soundproofing. Mr. Griggs, I understand your concerns, but we're very close to resolving these issues. Brian was saying, his voice pitched higher than usual. Our team has been working around the clock to implement comprehensive solutions. The response was apparently not encouraging. Brian's face went pale as he listened to what Nathan was saying, and his hand began trembling slightly as he gripped the phone. I see, Brian said finally. May I ask which vendor you've chosen to replace our services? I couldn't hear Nathan's response, but I could imagine his professional tone as he explained that Mallory Holdings had selected Shadeline Systems to provide their enterprise data management solutions. The exclusive licensing agreement would prevent any other vendor from offering comparable technology, making Realign Protocol the only viable solution for their specific requirements. Brian ended the call and stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the phone as if it contained answers to questions he couldn't formulate. Then he turned to address his team with the news that would effectively end his career at Vertex Dynamics. Mallory Holdings has terminated our contract, he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. They're implementing a new data management framework from a company called Shadeline Systems. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian's team exchanged glances that conveyed the full scope of their professional catastrophe. Losing Mallory Holdings wasn't just a financial blow. It was a reputation-destroying failure that would make it impossible to retain other major clients. Marcus Thompson was the first to speak. What do we know about Shadeline Systems? Are they using technology that's somehow related to our original Nexus Sync architecture? Brian shook his head slowly. I've never heard of them before today. Nathan Griggs said they're offering something called Realign Protocol, with capabilities that make our current approach obsolete. Realign protocol. I maintained my professional expression while internally celebrating the moment when Brian first heard the name of the technology that would destroy his stolen empire. He had no idea that the solution to his problems was sitting 20 feet away. Invisible behind the reception desk, he'd assigned me to as punishment. The afternoon brought more devastating news. 2 additional clients had scheduled meetings to discuss alternative data management solutions. The company's stock price was beginning to reflect investor concerns about the technical problems, and the board of directors had called an emergency session to discuss Brian's future with the company. During my lunch break, I received confirmation that the licensing agreement with Mallory Holdings had been finalized. The initial payment of $500,000 was being wired to Shadeline Systems' business account, with monthly licensing fees beginning immediately. I was no longer just a demoted engineer seeking revenge. I was the owner of a profitable technology company that was actively destroying my former employer's competitive position. The rest of the afternoon was spent watching Brian's world collapse in real time. Phone calls from panicked clients, emergency meetings with senior management, and desperate attempts to reverse engineer solutions that were beyond his team's capabilities. The man who'd stolen my work and demoted me to receptionist was discovering that intellectual property theft only worked when you understood what you were stealing. As the workday ended, I gathered my purse and walked toward the elevator with the satisfaction of someone who'd just executed the most elegant revenge in corporate history. I hadn't sabotaged Brian's systems or leaked confidential information. I'd simply created a better solution and made it available to the clients he'd failed to serve. The elevator doors closed, and I allowed myself a moment of genuine satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Shadeline Systems expanded its client base and Realign Protocol became the industry standard for enterprise data management. But tonight, I would celebrate the completion of a plan that had transformed professional humiliation into personal triumph. Phase 3 was complete. The game was over. And I had won. The following morning marked the beginning of the end for Brian Kessler's career at Vertex Dynamics. I arrived at the reception desk to find the office buzzing with rumors and speculation about the previous day's emergency board meeting. Brian's usual confident swagger had been replaced by the hunched shoulders and darting eyes of a man who knew his professional life was circling the drain. "Elise, please hold all my calls," he said as he hurried past my desk, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to focus on damage control." Damage control. I smiled as I updated the call routing system. The damage was far beyond anything Brian could control at this point. He'd built his reputation on stolen intellectual property, and now that foundation was crumbling as clients discovered superior alternatives. The morning brought a series of phone calls that painted a picture of accelerating corporate disaster. 3 more clients had scheduled meetings to discuss strategic alternatives to their current data management arrangements. The company's legal department was fielding inquiries from potential litigation attorneys representing clients who'd suffered financial losses due to system failures. And industry publications were beginning to report on Vertex Dynamics' technical problems in ways that would make it difficult to retain existing clients or attract new ones. During my coffee break, I received a call from Shadeline Systems' answering service. 2 additional Fortune 500 companies had inquired about Realign Protocol demonstrations. Having heard about Mallory Holdings' successful implementation through industry networks, word was spreading that there was a new player in the enterprise data management space, one that could deliver solutions where established vendors had failed. I scheduled the client meetings for the following week while watching Brian hold another emergency session with his depleted team. The stress was clearly affecting his health. His hands shook as he gestured at whiteboards. His voice cracked when he tried to project authority. And his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of sleepless nights and mounting desperation. "We need to identify the core architectural principles that Shadeline Systems is using," he was saying to his team, his words carrying the desperation of someone grasping for solutions he couldn't comprehend. "There has to be a way to reverse engineer their approach and implement similar capabilities." Reverse engineer. I almost laughed out loud. Brian was proposing to steal intellectual property from the same person whose work he'd already stolen once. without realizing the bitter irony of his situation. The architect of his destruction was sitting 20 feet away, invisible and unrecognized, watching him struggle with problems she'd already solved. Marcus Thompson raised his hand tentatively. "Brian, what if we tried to recruit someone from Shadeline Systems? Offer them a signing bonus and a senior position in exchange for bringing their knowledge to our team." "Excellent idea," Brian replied, seizing on the suggestion with obvious relief. "Find out who their technical leads are and see if we can make them an offer they can't refuse." I maintained my professional expression while processing this development. Brian was so desperate that he was willing to try recruiting from the company that was destroying his career, never suspecting that the founder and sole technical employee of Shadeline Systems was already on his payroll. The afternoon brought news that would accelerate Brian's downfall beyond anything I could have planned. Nathan Griggs had apparently shared details about Realign Protocol's capabilities with other industry executives, generating significant interest in Shadeline Systems' technology. The exclusive licensing agreement with Mallory Holdings was being held up as a model for how enterprise clients could gain competitive advantages through strategic technology partnerships. More importantly, several industry analysts were beginning to publish reports that compared Realign Protocol favorably to existing enterprise data management solutions. These reports didn't specifically mention Vertex Dynamics, but the implications were clear. There was a new technological standard in the marketplace, and companies using older approaches were at a significant disadvantage. During my final hour of the workday, I received the call that would seal Brian's fate. The CEO's assistant was scheduling a meeting between Brian and the board of directors for the following morning. The agenda included a review of recent client losses, an assessment of the company's technical capabilities, and a discussion of leadership changes necessary to restore investor confidence. I updated Brian's calendar with professional courtesy while calculating the probability of him surviving that meeting with his job intact. Based on the financial losses, client defections, and public relations disasters that had accumulated over the past week, his chances were essentially zero. That evening, I worked on preparing for the new client demonstrations that would expand Shadeline Systems' market presence. The success with Mallory Holdings had established credibility that would make it easier to attract additional enterprise clients. More importantly, each new implementation would further demonstrate Realign Protocol's superiority over competing technologies, making it increasingly difficult for companies like Vertex Dynamics to retain their market positions. The provisional patent application provided legal protection for my intellectual property, but the real security came from building a client base that depended on my technology for critical business operations. Each exclusive licensing agreement created another barrier that prevented competitors from duplicating my innovations. As I reviewed the technical documentation for Realign Protocol, I realized I'd accomplished something unprecedented in the technology industry. I'd been pushed out of a senior position by corporate politics and intellectual property theft, only to return as a competitor who made my former employer's technology obsolete. The receptionist desk that was supposed to be my punishment had become the perfect vantage point for observing my revenge unfold in real time. The next morning brought the conclusion I'd been anticipating since the day Brian announced my demotion. I arrived at the office to find security guards stationed near the main conference room, and Brian's team huddled in nervous clusters throughout the workspace. The board meeting was clearly not going well. Around mid-morning, Brian emerged from the conference room with the hollow expression of someone whose professional world had just collapsed. He walked directly to his office and began packing personal items into a cardboard box, his movements mechanical and defeated. "Elise, please forward all my calls to James Patterson in the legal department," he said as he passed my desk for the final time. "I won't be available for the rest of the day." I watched him walk toward the elevator, carrying his box of personal belongings and the remnants of a career built on stolen intellectual property. The man who'd demoted me to receptionist in order to claim credit for my innovations was leaving the company in disgrace, destroyed by his inability to understand or maintain the technology he'd tried to steal. The official announcement came an hour later. Brian Kessler had been terminated as Director of Engineering, effective immediately. James Patterson would serve as interim director while the company conducted a search for permanent leadership. All projects currently under Brian's supervision would be reassigned or discontinued based on their strategic value and technical feasibility. I answered phone calls and transferred messages while watching the aftermath of Brian's departure ripple through the organization. His team was being disbanded, their projects canceled or transferred to other departments. The BK methodology was being officially retired, along with all the associated documentation and training materials that had never worked properly anyway. During my lunch break, I received notification that 2 more Fortune 500 companies had signed letters of intent to license Realign Protocol for their enterprise data management requirements. Shadeline Systems was rapidly becoming the preferred solution for organizations that needed reliable, scalable technology they could depend on for critical business operations. I returned to the reception desk with the satisfaction of someone who'd achieved perfect justice through legal and ethical means. I hadn't sabotaged Brian's systems, leaked confidential information, or engaged in any form of corporate espionage. I'd simply created a better solution and made it available to clients who needed reliable technology more than they needed loyalty to vendors who couldn't deliver. The afternoon brought a final ironic twist. James Patterson appeared at my desk with a proposal that demonstrated just how completely Brian's theft had backfired. "Elise, I know the past few weeks have been difficult for you," he began, his tone suggesting he was about to offer some form of corporate compensation for my mistreatment. "The board has asked me to discuss your future with the company, including the possibility of returning to a senior technical position." I looked up from my computer with the polite attention of a receptionist who was curious about her employment prospects. "That's very kind of you to consider, Mr. Patterson. We're facing significant technical challenges that require someone with your expertise," he continued, apparently unaware that I was already solving those challenges through my own company. "The board recognizes that your knowledge of our core systems makes you uniquely qualified to help us recover from our recent difficulties." "I appreciate the offer," I replied, maintaining my professional tone while internally celebrating the beautiful irony of the situation. "But I've actually accepted a position with another company that's offering better opportunities for career advancement." James nodded understandingly. "May I ask which company? We might be able to match their offer if the position is comparable to what we're proposing." I smiled with the warmth of someone delivering perfectly justified revenge. "Shadeline Systems. They've offered me a senior consulting position that involves working with enterprise clients on advanced data management solutions." Voir. The expression that crossed James's face was worth 7 years of stolen credit and weeks of reception desk humiliation. He was beginning to understand that the company which had destroyed Vertex Dynamics' competitive position was somehow connected to the employee they'd demoted and marginalized. "Shadeline Systems," he repeated slowly. "The company that Mallory Holdings is now using for their data management requirements." "That's correct," I confirmed. "They've developed some remarkable technology that's generating significant interest in the enterprise market." James excused himself to make some phone calls, presumably to research Shadeline Systems and its mysterious connection to their former senior engineer. I returned to answering phones while calculating how long it would take him to discover that the architect of their destruction had been sitting at the reception desk all along. 2 hours later, James returned with a security guard and a termination letter. Apparently, someone in the legal department had identified the potential conflict of interest created by my connection to a competing technology company. "Elise, we're going to have to ask you to gather your personal belongings and surrender your access credentials," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Your employment with Vertex Dynamics is being terminated effective immediately." I smiled as I collected my purse and the small personal items I'd kept at the reception desk. "Of course, I understand completely." As I walked toward the elevator for the final time, I allowed myself to appreciate the perfect symmetry of my revenge. Brian had demoted me to receptionist as punishment for possessing knowledge he wanted to steal. Now I was being fired for possessing knowledge that made his stolen technology obsolete. The elevator doors closed, and I emerged into the lobby of a building where I would never work again. But I was no longer the defeated engineer who'd been pushed aside by corporate politics. I was the founder and owner of a technology company that was rapidly becoming the industry standard for enterprise data management. My phone buzzed with a text message from Shadeline Systems answering service. 3 more potential clients had called to schedule realigned protocol demonstrations. The revenge that had begun with a single word, receptionist, was now generating revenue, destroying my former employer's market position and establishing me as a legitimate competitor in the technology industry. I walked out into the afternoon sunlight with the satisfaction of someone who turned professional humiliation into personal triumph. The patent applications were filed, the exclusive licensing agreements were generating revenue, and the technology that Brian had tried to steal was now beyond his reach forever. Justice had been programmed, executed, and delivered with the precision of elegant code. The system was working exactly as designed.